You can read about Joel's incredible accomplishments in the insert that you have for tonight. I sometimes like to find a little bit of the rest of the story, and I've known Joel for many years. I've known a lot of his family for many years, including his mother-in-law, son, and daughter, and others. And probably the greatest compliment that I could pay to Joel is the compliments that they have all given Joel. And Joel was and is revered by everyone that I know. One other thing I'll say just before I mention a couple things about Joel, but I think I originally came to know Joel through kind of fellow investors. I'm in the investment business, and nearly everybody that I met told me when they found out that I was a member of the church would ask if I knew Joel and tell me how impressed they were with Joel and talk about Joel. One of them said he was the best investor that they ever knew, and another said that he was the best man that they ever knew. And I think you could put those things together and really combine a lot of who Joel is. He really is. He's a wonderful man with great integrity. One of the articles that he wrote that I really enjoy, and I enjoy many of his articles, but it's about second level integrity, just being a man of great, or a person of great integrity of reflexes, and Joel really exemplifies that. As I was leaving my office tonight to come down here and mention that I was coming down, one of my colleagues said that he'd had Joel in a class and pulled up all of his notes, or not maybe all of his notes, but notes from Joel's class, and you know, they weren't notes about technical business issues. They were notes about life issues, like decide who you are, find people that you love, and do the things that make you happy in life. And I think Joel, again, exemplifies a lot more than just good business. And you'll hear a lot about the good business, but that Joel is a good man in addition to a good businessman. As I talked a little bit to his son yesterday, Clint, who runs their family office, I think I got a little bit more of the story, and I don't want to be long with Joel or with the introduction because we want to hear from Joel. But just to mention a few things, Joel came from a relatively modest background, grew up in what is called a Quonset hut. Who knows what a Quonset hut is? All right. Clint was worried that some people might not know what that is, but I don't think I have to explain it to you. His father was a professor, a teacher. That's an important point because I think that stayed with Joel. Joel's a professor or teacher at Stanford today. And I think in the end, Joel, much like his father, really is at heart a teacher, teaching people either through business or through literally classes such as he's been teaching at Stanford for 20 years. I might mention that the two classes, I teach a class once a year at Stanford, and again, Joel comes up as I think the classes that he teaches, one on leadership and one on building businesses, are nearly always the favorite classes of the students, almost always rated number 1 and 2. But just to continue the story about Joel, a couple of interesting things. First, when Joel was deciding what to do with life, he'd gone to university, I think in Michigan first, and then gone to BYU. And some of you might have experienced this dilemma about what to do. Joel made his decision by taking the GRE. I think he was studying psychology at the time, and GMAT and LSAT, and committed that he would go whatever direction he scored highest in. Fortunately, the GMAT was the highest, and Joel went into business and applied to Harvard Business School. Got into Harvard Business School straight out of BYU. And as I understand the story, when he was graduating from Harvard Business School and again deciding where to go and what to do with life, he looked on the interview boards at the business school, and there was one job that was in France, and given that Joel had served his LDS mission in France, he decided that that'd be a good one to pursue. It happened to be with a company called Trammell Crow, which was a large real estate development company, and as I understand the story, Joel went to the hotel where Trammell Crow was interviewing, and let me just tell you that the name Trammell Crow is both the name of the company and also an individual's name, Trammell Crow. And Joel asked at the front desk where he might find Trammell Crow. The front desk person told him where to find Trammell Crow, and Joe went to that room, knocked on the door, only to find Trammell Crow, as in the person, still in his robe, just getting out of a shower. And, is that right? And invited Joel in. Joel, I think, said he could wait, but no, Trammell Crow invited him in and asked him to sit on the bed while he completed shaving and interviewed Joel and sent him to France, where Joel ran or worked in their business there. I think that business actually, at Joel's recommendation, was closed in France, and they brought Joel over, and Joel very quickly became the CFO of what, again, was then and continues to be one of the largest commercial real estate companies in the world, and Joel was 29 when he became CFO. Joel progressed through Trammell Crow, became president and then CEO of Trammell Crow, and then when Trammell Crow was sold and Joel left Trammell Crow, Joel started his businesses, including Peterson Partners, that now has real estate, search fund, venture, private equity, and I believe that's about the time you started teaching at Stanford as well, isn't it? 20 years ago. So I don't know how Joel does all that he does, but I'm very grateful that he's here with us tonight and look forward to hearing from Joel.
In any event, I thought I'd go over just a little bit some of the same things, just so you get a sense of what kind of a discount you should apply to whatever I tell you. I think it's always a good thing to know, how much to discount any speaker. So if you kind of look the numbers here, I'm 68 years old. I've been married 44 years to the same woman. We have 7 kids and 22 grandchildren. My work history, you kind of heard there. I was at Trammell Crow for 18 years. I've been at Stanford for 24, Peterson Partners for 21. Now, I was at JetBlue before we had planes. I became the chairman about 7 or 8 years ago, and I'll continue on through that until we deliver a hotel, the only hotel on the grounds at JFK. I don't know if any of you know the Saarinen building, the TWA clamshell that's right out in front of our Terminal T5. In any event, we're turning that, it's been empty. Well, it's had rats and pigeons in it for the last, so not really empty, but for the last 30 years, it's been the hotel of rats and pigeons. We're turning that 175,000 square foot building into a lobby of a hotel, and we're building 250 rooms on either side, so a 500 room hotel at JFK, and that'll be kind of my last act at JetBlue, is to deliver this hotel. So I started in the real estate business 45 years ago, and I'll end delivering that building to the city of New York, and so I'm excited about that. I started a business called Whitman Peterson a number of years ago, back in the real estate business after I left it for a number of years, with a fellow by the name of Bob Whitman. Does anybody know Bob? Bob, a couple of you do. Bob is the chairman and CEO of Franklin Covey. I'm sure a number of you have read Stephen Covey's stuff, so Bob's the chairman and CEO there. He was my CFO at Trammell Crow Company when I was the CEO there. And so then I've been on about 35 boards over the years, public, private, nonprofit, for-profit boards. The courses I teach at Stanford, I started out teaching the essentials of real estate because I've been in the real estate business, so about 10 years I did that, and then I've since started teaching these courses that you just heard about. I teach a bunch of exec ed courses there too, which is fun. I teach YPO, exec ed, and then I teach NBA players and NFL players, which is really interesting. Every once in a while you're in the middle of a class and you'll recognize a face and you feel like stopping and say, ooh, could I get your autograph? So it's fun. And then I write for LinkedIn, and I've written for Forbes, and I'm doing a book here in the next couple of, I guess, weeks now, 6 or 8 weeks now. It'll come out. It's going to be called The 10 Laws of Trust. And it's basically kind of a thesis that I've got is to build great companies, you have to build high trust cultures. And people have to trust you. To build a great family, you have to have high trust. To build a great ward, you have to have high trust. To build a great company, you have to have high trust. And so there are ways to increase the trust levels within an organization. So what I try to describe are 10 ways that high trust organizations operate. So if you're leading one or operating in a group, you can actually increase the trust level of an enterprise. So one of the things that I teach when I teach these entrepreneurial management companies is this idea of the power of trust and how it gets you from infancy when you're just in a startup. Any of you involved in startups here? Or in Silicon Valley? I knew there'd be some. So I'm really interested in these things that take you from sort of courtship to infancy to go-go to toddler stage, all the way up to adolescent, till finally they get to prime. And I say to all the businesses that we invest in and all the entrepreneurs that we work with, that the objective is to get to prime and stay there for 100 years. And at prime, what happens at prime is all of your systems are aligned. Your values are consistent with your objectives. Your objectives drive your strategy builds a moat around the business. You have tactics that are assigned where you have champions for every project. You have a budget, you have deliverables, you have due dates, and then you have metrics. You have controls, you have ways of measuring things. If you get all of those aligned perfectly, and by the way, in a dynamic world, they don't stay aligned. You've got to keep tweaking it. That's the job of management. But if you can get all that to happen, you can build high trust. So one of the things you try to do is build around this so that you get them aligned and you get them to prime and you keep them there for 100 years. So that's an objective to have. Another thing that I think is really powerful is this idea of culture. And it was Peter Drucker that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The culture of if you want to build a high trust business, get a great culture, and it will allow you to stay at prime for a long time. This can happen, again, in a ward, in a family, in any small group of people, in a team. You can build a culture. These are shared values, and if the culture is bad, it's really awful. So you have kind of a distribution around culture, and you can see that most of them are either troubled or functional is about it. If you think of a great culture, I think we've got a great culture at JetBlue. We've won the J.D. Power Award there 11 straight years. I don't know if any of you have flown JetBlue? Hooray. And don't you find the people are friendly there? I mean, I get this all the time. People come. I had a guy that runs Bridgespan, the managing partner at Bridgespan, come up to me and say that he had just had the worst and the best experience he'd ever had flying. He said the worst part of it was we were delayed for 8 hours because it was when the temperature was 35 below zero in Boston, and the pipes froze and everything. And all flights, everybody's flights were delayed, and that was terrible. He had to go to somebody. He said, but the experience with JetBlue was phenomenal because the pilots and the flight attendants stayed out with the customers, and they worked with them. They brought them food. They ran out of food in the airport, and they had food trucked in, and they did all these kinds of things. So, so I think if you think about it, to build a great culture, you're 3 standard deviations away from the mean. And so to build a high trust culture, you have to say we are really going to be in the top 3 to 5% of all enterprises. If you think of a terrible culture, a hostile culture, can you think of one? The U.S. Congress is a hostile culture. That's a culture. There's a culture there, and there's a culture of disrespect, of not listening to each other, of being mistrustful, etc. So you can see how much gets done in a low trust culture. Not a whole lot gets done. In a high trust culture, things are much faster, etc. So building culture is tough. Here's the slide I always like to look. Does anybody know what this is? Do we have any developers in here? No developers. These are all high-tech folks. Yeah.
Well, you're digging a hole to build some kind of column. Driving piles.
Yeah, you're actually drilling to get down to bedrock. So these are really, and so the last building I built, we drilled down 55 feet to get to bedrock. Then we put all kinds of rebar in there, and then put concrete, and then shook it all around and everything, and then covered it all up. You don't see a thing. You've spent millions of dollars, and the land looks almost exactly the way it looked before you got started. If you don't do that, though, if you don't spend that money drilling down to bedrock, here's what happens. This is actually a home we owned. We came home from church one day, walked into the living room, and that's what it looked like. And they hadn't gone all the way to bedrock. And that's what happens in organizations that don't build great cultures and don't have high trust, is when the winds blow or anything happens, they start to come apart. So you don't see you don't see a lot of the work to build a high trust culture when things are going just fine, when sales are going well, when you're expanding, et cetera. But when the winds start to blow, you know, we had this happen at Trammell Crow Company where it was a tense time, and the only way that we got through it was our lenders trusted us. We'd built a high trust set of relationship. So how do you learn about trust? You all, do you feel like you're trustful? Do you feel like there are times when you're mistrustful? Are you wary? And what's the right level of trust to have? And how do you figure out who to trust, who not to trust? This is a big question in life. So learning about trust, I think we learn about it in our families. We learn about it by watching politicians. People think of trust as this soft, fuzzy, oh, I feel good about them, therefore I trust them. It's a very hard-edged concept, and you can get a lot better, you can get good at by being intentional about figuring out who you're going to trust and who not to trust. So the president mentioned, you know, where I got started. Here's this Quonset hut thing that I was born in this Quonset hut here, and I think this has something to do with why I learned about trust. I think not having anything in life, you learn who you can trust and who you can't trust. So I started out there, and then we really hit the big time. And here was my first home. My father was getting his PhD at this time. He was obviously not in landscape architecture. And then my first business, the first business I started was when I was 11 years old. And it was basically hiring my younger brother, who was 6 years my junior, so that means he's 5 years old. He was my employee. He had a red, what do they call them, radio flyer wagon. And I grew the vegetables. My dad, you know, fronted me the capital to buy the seeds, and he furnished the water and the little plot. And I grew the vegetables, and then I had my little brother. It's always smart to have a cute little guy delivering veggies, you know, and he would deliver them around the neighborhood. We found a letter to my grandmother a few years later where I said, "Grandma, I had a great summer. I made $14 and I paid Ted a nickel." And that was the beginning of my entrepreneurial career. You got to control your costs. But I do think that there's something about agriculture that teaches you a lot about faith and trust and what you can rely on and what you can't rely on. There's some things you can't rely on. A next lesson that where I learned in growing up about trust was one that came with this Oldsmobile. This is a 1950 Oldsmobile. This was a car we had in 1963 when I was about to turn 16 years old, and my dad said, "Why don't you practice driving up and down the driveway before you go to driver's ed?" We had a 90-foot long driveway, and it was one of these L-shaped drives, and so you could back out of the carport, and then there was a berm. There was a curb and then a berm that dropped off about 10 feet. And so I backed out, paused, let the tires hit the curb, and then accelerated, but I forgot to put it in drive. I left it in reverse and up over the curb, and I hung the car up there, and I sweated bullets. I tried like crazy. I got neighbor kids to try to push the car back, and then finally I gave up and went back in the house and got my dad and said sheepishly, "I need your help to get this car back up there." So he helped me. He actually recruited a neighbor, and we got the car back up on the thing. And as he turned to go back into the house, I thought, well, that's it for driving, probably forever, but certainly for now. He turned around and tossed me the keys and said, "Don't forget to put it in drive, son." And I've thought of that my whole life as I've had people that I'm trying to train with this idea of being trustworthy, and thought about, because people fail. People don't always deliver what they think they're going to deliver. And I've often thought about, if I believe somebody is fundamentally trustworthy, this idea of tossing them the keys. And I'll tell you one other story that taught me this as a young person growing up, and it has to do with this little Honda 50 motorcycle. I don't know if any of you had these, but this was what I bought when I was 16. I convinced my parents that I was responsible and I could handle a Honda 50 motorcycle. So I bought it, drove home. It had 3.2 miles on it. I picked up my little brother, put him on the back, and we took off down the hill, and I hit gravel and spun out, and the motorcycle dumped us, bent the frame, the fork on the thing. I was gashed up and was bleeding down my leg and in my hand. I still have a scar on my hand today from it, and my little brother was okay. And I went limping back, having to almost carry this bike up there, and my dad spotted me coming towards the house. My mom was not nearly this good about it. She freaked out. But my dad spotted me, and he could tell that I was okay, and that the bike, would need some repairs and everything. And once he was assured of that and could tell that everything was going to be right, he said, "How's your bike, son?" And I thought, wow, that's an amazing dad who can step back from this, not freak out and say, "You're not getting this motorcycle. You'll never ride a motorcycle again." Just say, "How's your bike, son?" And he trusted me then to learn. And I learned. I learned from being trusted and trusted and trusted over and over again. Another way that I've learned about trust is in this class that I teach on leadership. We have, you may recognize some of these names, but this is the cast of characters that we bring in every year to expose Stanford MBA students to. And they talk about it. Some of these people are highly trustworthy and others not so much. Some are narcissists, some are, and we ask the students, would you hire these folks to work for you? Would you have them hire? Would you like to work for them? Why or why not? What is it about them? And the ones who build great businesses typically are ones that you trust. Not always, but typically ones you trust. Here's some more that go into this. So, and you may recognize a bunch of these, and some you won't recognize. There's leaders that come in all shapes and forms and doing all kinds of things. So in the 10 Laws of Trust, I kind of start out with these quotes here. If you think about trust in your life, one of them is very similar to something David O. McKay said. The second one that you see on George MacDonald there is very similar to what David O. McKay said about trust. There's another quote. I'm quoting me now. This is something I wrote in this book that's coming out, that it's the operating system of a life well lived. So if you really think about it, if you build your life so that you are completely trustworthy and you build high trust relationships with others, you're going to have a much happier, much more productive life. You also will risk betrayal. So without trust, there's no chance for betrayal. So the odds of going through life without ever being betrayed, if you're a trusting person, are very low. So you're going to have to figure out how to deal with betrayal too. So that's one of the things that we talk about in this book. So there are basically two truths that I try to get across in this book. One is that high trust, altruistic organizations will prevail over low trust organizations, and high trust leaders will be more successful than low trust leaders. I'm going to give you a second to read this next quote, but this is from two evolutionary biologists who describe a thought experiment. So take a second and read this. So I think this is a really powerful truth, this idea that within groups, that you can get warring going on. And some of you may work within companies where this happens, or institutions, or even families where elbows out works within the organization. But that organization will not compete effectively against collaborative organizations, organizations that have figured out how to build high trust. If you think about this, the idea of a relay team, a high school 4x100 relay team will beat the Olympic 400-meter sprinter. Just to give you a feeling for how powerful this idea of collaboration is. Any good high school relay team will beat the gold medalist in the Olympics, the one person operating alone, because it doesn't require trust to do that. So the power of trust, the power of collaboration will win every time. So you want to think about, how do you build high trust in your life? How do you build a high trust family? How do you build a high trust organization, a ward, a team that's doing anything? What are the things? So I think one of the things you have to think about is, what is trust? And trust is when you give up power to another person, when you trust another person. So if you're hoarding power and keeping power for yourself, that means you're not trusting. So trust and power are at odds at some level. And I think one of the ways to think about this is this image of a sailboat versus a powerboat. If you want to get across a lake and you're a CEO or you're in charge of something and you think of it as a powerboat, you just pull the lever and you blast across the lake, no matter what the other conditions are. If you think about you're building high trust, often you have to tack. I had a university president one time give me this, this model. He said, I learned how to get across the lake by tacking, by building alliances, by building collaborations and whatever. And I could get across the lake doing that. I couldn't power across the lake. People who power across the lake often leave in their wake lots of detritus, a big mess. So then I think if you think about, well, how do organizations operate? Various organizations operate. And I think if you kind of compare this, actually this was, I remember reading an article when I was a teenager, and I think it was David O. McKay who said something like there are really only 5 motivators in life: force, fear, reward, duty, and love. And you can figure out every single thing we do is driven by some element of one of those 5 motivations. And if you think about the various kinds of organizations, they're driven. So a prison, for example, will be driven by force. You have armed guards, you have manacles, you have bars, and you can keep you. But the minute you remove the force on there, people will misbehave. So force is the only thing that controls behavior. So it's very temporary. Fear is also a very powerful motivator. But once people aren't afraid anymore, they start moving around that. Reward is a bit that way too. I mean, I was on the board of an organization that mistreated its people, was brutal on virtually every count, but when it came bonus time, they wrote big checks. So the rewards were big. And so people would get these big 6-figure bonuses. They were all unhappy, they were all miserable, they didn't trust each other, but they hung around because of the big check. Well, that's not a very sustainable thing. Once things go bad, then all of a sudden people don't behave. So if you can really figure out how to move an organization, if you want to last for 100 years, if you want to build something that's enduring, if you can build it on the notion of duty or love, you can actually remove all these other things and people will do it. So I've actually operated several turnarounds where you look at it and say, man, I don't know if we're going to make it. It's high risk. And people basically link up. Do you know what being belayed is? When you're on the cliff and you're roped in together, and you basically say, boy, I am relying on the people that I'm connected. I'm trusting these people to get me up or down this cliff. I remember a number of years ago, I was, do any of you know Ned Speaker Properties around here? Ned, did you really? Well, Ned was my partner for 17 years, and he and I butted heads. It's hard to imagine butting heads with Ned Speaker, but it can happen. In any event, we were on an outward bound, and I was at the top of a cliff, a 100-foot sheer granite cliff, and I was getting ready to back off to jump off the cliff, and then what's it called when you bounce your way down the rappel? I was getting ready to rappel, and I looked up to see who was belaying me, and it was Ned Speaker. I thought, oh my gosh, this guy has my life in his hands, and I've had conflict with him. But I trusted him, and I knew that he saw that he had my life in his hands too, and there was this bond, this kind of looking at each other, and there was this bond. So I think, in these organizations that are aligned, that follow the laws of trust, people feel belayed, and they trust each other. If not, what you've got is you have to operate by power. So in low power organization, or in low trust organizations, you have to have high power. You have to have the ability, you have to have fear and force in high measure in order to get stuff done. So people who operate in low trust organizations, this is actually there's a book by Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's a professor at Stanford Business School, he's written 12 or 13 books about power. And fundamentally, his notion about power is that it's a personal asset. It's a derivative of making threats, breaking rules, doing all kinds of things, that kind of lord over people, and you get more stuff, and it's all about you. High trust organizations, it's a stewardship. Having power is a stewardship, and it's a function of knowledge and competence, and it's about achieving common goals. It's all about the mission, it's not about me. So in high trust versus low trust organizations, odds are you've all operated in varying degrees of trust in the various organizations within which you've worked. And I'll bet you anything you're happier. You find more meaning in your work when you're in a high trust organization. So if you're in a position to create the kind of organization that you would like to be in yourself, why not do it as a high trust organization? So very quickly now, I'll wrap up here and then we can talk about anything you want to. But trust fundamentally, if you want to decide on, who do you trust, it fundamentally depends on three characteristics: character, competence, and authority. And if you don't have all three of them, you shouldn't trust. It's a naive trust. So if you think about who has character, who would you trust because their character? I ask execs this all the time that come into Stanford. Who would they trust? And you know who they mention? Who would you think everybody trusts for issues of who's got your back, who would never do anything to harm you? It's mom. It's always mom. And then I ask the next question, well, competence. Would you trust your mom to fly you across the Atlantic in a 747? Would you trust her? Do you trust her? You just said you trusted her. Well, you wouldn't trust her to do that. Actually, I was teaching a class one time, and a guy said, I would trust my mom. She's a left seat captain for British Airways. So, okay. Occasionally, that happens. But so you got to have character and competence, but even that isn't enough. If people don't have the authority, if you have a lawyer who's high character, who's a really competent lawyer, and you say, I'm going to trust you to keep me from having to pay taxes. I don't want to pay any more taxes, and I trust you to keep that from happening. Well, that's a crazy trust because he doesn't have the authority, or she doesn't have the authority. So you have to have character, competence, and the power to deliver. And without all three, your trust will be dashed. So anytime you're thinking, when you're assessing, trusting somebody, make sure that you've checked all of those boxes. Then another thing to think about when you're thinking about sort of applying this notion of trust is to think about the three kinds of trust. The first kind is representative trust. That's the trust that you have for your lawyer or your doctor or your dentist. It's not reciprocal, really. All you're doing is giving them information, and then you're relying on them to carry something out for you. Then there's that's representative trust. Reciprocal trust, the reciprocal trust is the kind that exists between great business partners, between spouses, between family members, where you are relying on each other, where you're belayed. You're connected to each other, and each of your lives depends on the other. That's the most powerful form, but representative is also a powerful. Then there's this other kind that's pseudo-trust. This is the way that I described that mafia dons have this kind of trust for each other. They can trust that if you don't do what you say you're going to do, you're going to get shot. It's like I can trust Donald Trump to gouge me on a contract if he can. I can trust that that's what will happen. So that's a pseudo-trust. That's a contractual trust. That's a trust that sometimes happens in business, but it's not a real trust. So building the bonds that make business great, then, here are the 10 laws, and I'll just run through them, and I won't give examples so we can talk about it. But I think all trust starts with personal integrity. If people say one thing and do another, if they have a certain kind of business integrity but not personal integrity, people are smart. They'll figure out not to trust. And so organizational integrity starts out with the leadership having integrity. Number two, it's rooted in respect for everybody. Organizations that show disrespect for people cannot build high trust. I remember one time Trammell Crow, we owned the Dallas Market Center, which is a 7 million square foot wholesale merchandise mart. And buyers come in there and wholesalers distribute and present their goods there. And I remember there was a buyer, a very powerful buyer, was there who was just cursing out the woman who was checking badges at the gate. And he was getting, you know who I am? And just barking at her and everything. And Trammell saw this, and he walked over and he took the man by the arm and said, we don't allow anybody to treat our folks this way. And he ushered him out of the building. Well, how long do you think it was before everybody at the Dallas Market Center heard that story? All of the hundreds of employees heard that Trammell Crow had ushered a buyer out of the Dallas Market Center because he'd barked at this 75-year-old woman who was checking people in. It didn't take any time at all. And showing that kind of respect was a really powerful way to build trust within an organization. So it's very tough to do that without that. You have to empower others. This is the tossing the keys to people that you trust, that you want to give some trust to. You have to empower them. Then you have to Measure whatever it is you want to achieve. If you're ever in an organization where there are no measurements, I try to post things. What I try to do is, in every organization that I'm involved in, I try to figure out what are the most important projects we've got and limit those, so you only have a certain number of projects. Then make sure that you have a champion, a budget, a time frame, and deliverables, and that you post that. And you post that in every place that people can see it. And if you don't do that, people don't trust. If they don't really know what the measurements are, they learn not to trust. It feels political to them. So I think if you want to build a high trust organization, you measure what you want to achieve. You've all seen organizations that have mission statements. They frame them and post them on the wall. And a lot of times all that does is create cynicism. It almost never works to do that. And the reason, because people don't live up to their flowery words. They were created somewhere else. They're put on the wall and people don't live. So the way to build high trust is you create the mission statement. You create the common dream. And it's the process of creating the common dream that builds the trust between people. So you create that together. You keep everyone informed. If you're in an organization and if you read something in the newspaper that's happening in your organization, trust goes down. So you have to keep everyone informed. Now, in a public company, it can be really tricky because you can't leak information before it's public. What we try to do at JetBlue is publish exactly within a nanosecond of things going out to the press so that our employees hear from us first in almost every instance. And then we try to report bad news as well as good news. A lot of times people put spin on things and only tell the good news. That creates mistrust. If you want to create high trust, you tell people the bad news right along with the good news. You expect conflict and you embrace respectful conflict. So you're not afraid of conflict. I always describe that in low trust organizations are like hospitals. They're quiet, but there's disease everywhere. So if you think about a low trust organization, so this idea that the organization is noisy, that people debate, they disagree, that can be evidence of high trust. So that's another law for me. One that you don't see in all leaders, but I think the great leaders that I've worked with show humility. They show vulnerability. They admit errors, and I think that builds trust. So I think that's law number 8. Negotiations. There's a lot of people who hate negotiations and think it's just this bare-knuckled power fight. It's people shouting at each other with lawyers and accountants around them, and that's what a negotiation is. Think about a negotiation as a conversation. You're having conversations all the time with your parents, with your children, with your siblings, with people in your organization. Those are all negotiations in a way. They're trades that are being made, and there's no reason that they can't be respectful and thoughtful and that you can't solve for a win on the other side. So high trust organizations have win-win conversations. And then finally, proceed with care. That means apply these principles of the different kinds of trust, of character, competence, and authority. Only trust when trust is smart. Don't be foolishly trusting. Now, quickly, you've got to be intentional about it, and you've got to realize there's a risk of betrayal. And if there's betrayal, you need to overcome it. 99% of people respond to being trusted. So it's like what I say about raising my kids. I find them doing something that approximates what I'd love to see them do, and then reward the heck out of that. Hug them and celebrate it, and then by rewarding people doing things that you like, you see them do more and more of that. So betrayal's likely, it stings, it may not be personal, reconciliation is possible but difficult, and the steps are demanding. And I kind of go over those in the book. So I'm not selling a book tonight, but this is coming out. Actually, I've got this is what it'll look like, and it's only this long. So you can read it on a flight. But I actually think that if I sort of boil down all the things that I've done, and I've bought 150 businesses over the years, turned around several of them, and been involved in all kinds of areas. I think the most important thing that I've taken away from that is, how do you build high trust teams? high trust relationships, high character, competence, and empowerment between people. That's more powerful than any strategy manual or any financial structure or any product design or anything. Is this idea of how do you build, and it's really hard work. You have to be very intentional about it. So with that, I'm sure I've used up all the time. I want to be respectful of what you want to do here tonight. So I'm going to look to somebody to say, do you want to? All right. Thank you. No questions. Yeah. You know, it's the big dilemma. I actually think we've got to figure out how to get different people into politics. You know, politics used to be the art of the possible. It used to be that we were not so extreme. The polemics now are such that, and somebody has figured out that negative advertising is the only kind that moves the needle. So now you have people calling each other liars and shouting at each other. That is no way to get things done. And so to me, I think you have to have people that have character, competence, and are willing to do that. Who was it? William Safire. They asked him, you know, he's the New York Times writer. They asked him one time why he didn't accept a role in, I think it was the Nixon administration, as Secretary of State or something like that. And he says, well, I didn't want to take the demotion. You know, and I think that's how so I know lots of really competent, capable business leaders who just basically say, I wouldn't want to take the demotion. Mitt Romney's a close friend of mine. I grew up with him in Michigan. We're the same age. I grew up with him in Michigan. We vacationed together. Our kids know each other. We were at business school together. And I watched him go through this thing, and I mean, it's brutal. And so to get somebody of that level of competence and character to go in and take the abuse is just tough. So I think my guess is it's going to take a crisis, you know, where we really need leadership. We've had this happen several times. You know, the election of 1860 was an election where there were 4 candidates. Lincoln won with 40% of the vote. And that was a very extreme, and the Republic was in peril. You know, so we may have something like that, and we typically have leaders emerge. So my guess is we're on this slippery slope, crashing down to the bottom, and that at some point leaders will emerge and people will take it on.
That's a good segue into the second part of my question, which is, why is Trump running for president and not you?
Well, he's a narcissist. And, you know, in this class at Stanford, we study productive narcissists. And Larry Ellison is one example. Tom Siebel's another. There's several of them around here who are really, they're very narcissistic. You've heard the Larry Ellison joke. The difference between Larry Ellison and God is that God doesn't think he's Larry Ellison. So, you know, I mean, they're very productive. I mean, they have got great ideas. They motivate people. Trump inherited, you know, $200 million from his father, who was kind of a slumlord in Manhattan. If he'd put money in the S&P, he would have done as well as he's done. I mean, so I'm not sure he's even really a productive narcissist. It's like having Kim Kardashian run for president. What's that? So why don't I? I'm too old. I'm actually the age of Hillary and Trump. I mean, but I just feel too old. Yeah. But I have had a couple of people ask me, which is very flattering. Or they don't like me very well. Yeah. There was a comment back here first, and then we'll skip back up here. If you can't figure out how to get together, it's very difficult to build high trust. So, and I think it's very difficult to build, sometimes you can build a high trust team within a low trust organization, and sometimes the high trust team develops high trust because they're in a low trust organization. But in terms of being able to be the leavening for the loaf, it's very tough. High trust comes from the leadership of the organization. So to me, proximity, frequency of discussion, sharing of values. I think you have to get, this will sound harsh, but I think you have to get the right people on the bus and you have to get the wrong people off the bus. And it's the only, I've had very little success at retraining people, getting them to be something they're not. And so my view is hire for values. I can give you experience, I can give you training, but I'm not going to change the values. What are your values? Your values are where you spend your time, your money, and your mind share. Those are your real values. So you can tell me anything you want about your values. Many of you will talk about virtues and pretend they're your values. But really, if I follow you around for a week and watch what you do, I'll know what your values are. So I like to say, my values are all these things, but then I'll watch TV. I'll waste time watching TV. Well, somehow there's a value in that kind of release and recreation. That's a value to me. I'm embarrassed by it. I wish it weren't, but it's a value to me. So if you really think about your values, think about where your mind goes when it doesn't have to go anywhere. Where you spend your money and where you spend your time, those are your values. So I really try to hire for values and then get people off the bus who don't share values. Because it's very hard to build alignment. I didn't put up my chart on sort of how you get alignment, but it starts with values. It goes values, objectives, strategy, tactics, and controls. Aligning those things, but starting with values. So within a team you can do that, but you can't do it if you're not close enough to communicate. So I typically have a conversation, and I like to know the points at which they've made changes in direction. What happened? How did this go? There's some standard questions that people prepare for in interviews. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? You've heard them all. And everybody's prepared for those and has a canned answer. If you go back and say, you changed colleges, what was the reason for that? And then you changed jobs here. What caused that change? And just follow them through the whole thing. And then the other thing I like to search for are people who are winners, people who figure out how to win. Because people who have figured out how to win hate losing. They hate losing more than they even like winning. And people who like to win figure out ways to keep winning. So if you want to build a great high-trust organization, I think you keep hiring winners. I find that when I'm coaching people, if I'm specific, if I give specific examples, rather than just broad categories, and say, what I used to try to do is catch people in the moment. So for example, this won't be quite on point, but you'll get the idea. After we would make a sales pitch to somebody, I would grab the team around me and just say, okay guys, let's talk about how we did on this thing. I think, and I would start with myself and say, I think I blew it when I kept selling after the sale was made. I wanted to deliver this thing and help me not do that anymore. And that kind of opened it up and people would start talking. If you can get a dialogue going, but I was senior enough that I could do that and then people would follow me. From below, I think it's really tough. And I think if you can't get it doing, odds are that you probably will drift into doing something else over time. Yeah, so I watch how they treat people that don't matter, per se. So, and I watch how they treat suppliers and lenders and competitors. People who talk down about competitors and curse them out and who are willing to ooch on things. You're not going to build high trust. People who are respectful. That's why I think this law of respect is really powerful. If you see somebody that's doing that, the odds are there's a high trust culture there. And if you don't see that, my guess is, if you've ever had, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being around somebody who's bad-mouthing somebody else. You go away and you think, I wonder if they're talking about me, that way when I'm not there. So I think organizations that are high trust do not badmouth competitors, suppliers, employees. They just don't do it. They show respect at every level. I've had to learn that one the hard way. Because I started out very aggressive, and I thought you win, somebody loses, and they're bad and whatever. And I just learned that that's not the way that you win. You win in this co-opetition, this collaboration. There's an ecosystem within which you build high trust, and everybody's a greater winner if you do that. So I test for that. Who I married. Nothing comes close. I know that's kind of within this group that people will nod, but people are shocked when I say outside of this, because people want to know, how do you see it? And they don't want to hear that I found this sweetheart and have stayed married to her for 44 years, and that's been by far the most important thing that I've ever done. So I'll tell you a funny story that's kind of related. to that. I remember at Harvard Business School, Trammell Crow came to visit. And it was at that point in time, Harvard Business School was just very elbows out, bunch of tough guys, investment banker types and everything. And one of the guys raised his hand and said, Trammell, to what do you attribute your success? And Trammell had this bald head, and he was about 55 years old at the time, and he had this furrowed brow, and he went like that, and he looks up and he said, love. And the room just went dead silent. I said, oh my gosh, did he just say that? But I worked with him for years, and it really was. He loved the people he worked with. He loved the contract. He loved life. He was incredible that way. And so I would say that, finding somebody, there's a writer, a Christian apologist by the name of Frederick Buechner, who wrote that what people need in life are three things. Someone to love, a work to do, a person to be. So if you can answer those questions, a person to be, someone to love, and a work to do. And figure that out. Those are really hard questions, but I think those are the quintessential questions of life. And so I think the closer you get to figuring those out and the earlier you figure those out, the more likely you are to have peace in your life. And the more self-confident and the more peaceful you are in your life, the more you can trust others, the more others will trust you, the more you can build these high-trust organizations. If you're insecure, I actually think if you're insecure, you kind of behave like Donald Trump. To me, that's evidence of insecurity. We have to keep telling people how stupid everybody else is and how you're the only smart one. That is rampant insecurity. So I think a whole lot of it is get secure in yourself. Love yourself. Start out by loving yourself. Doesn't mean you like everything about yourself. I used to tell people that I loved them. That didn't mean I liked them, but I love them. Well, yeah, last question. So I invest largely in growing enterprises. So I'm at a small enough level. So typically the equity checks that we write are between $5 and $15 million, which is much smaller than most private equity, where you're underwriting EBITDA, you're evaluating. So I think in those cases, you probably do something other than what we would do. But we're looking to grow the business. And when you're doing that, the most important thing is who is the leader? What is the character of the leader? So we spend a lot of time assessing entrepreneurs and assessing teams because we really believe that a great team, it's kind of the opposite of what Warren Buffett says. He says if a great management team comes up against a bad business, bet on the business because the business will. Our experience is bet on the team. And these younger growing organizations, bet on the team. They will morph things into where they need to be. I'll give you a quick example and then we'll wrap up. Do any of you know Asurion? Is that a name anybody has heard of? So we bought Asurion. I was one of the original investors in Asurion. It was a towing company in Houston, Texas. It was a road rescue. It was called Mr. Rescue, in fact. And we would go out with vans and we would take people batteries and tires and help them get on their way. And that was the business. Today, it's an $8 billion specialty insurance company worldwide. And we morphed that business from being a product or a service company into being a network, a channel company, where we were selling through the cellular phone industry. We're providing, and then we provided insurance to the cellular phone, and then we provided data insurance, then we provided specialty insurance, then we took it global. So, but that was the management team. The original business kind of stunk. Driving vans around Houston to, that was not a great business. But today it's worth billions of dollars, and it was because we evaluated the team and the trustworthiness of the team. And even then, we had to bring on new people. The guy that I think made a huge difference, there's a fellow by the name of Brett Camoli, who was graduated number 2 in his class at West Point. He's just a ramrod straight, military, great guy, high character, high competence, understands authority and power, and he just brought that business together. So that's how I do it.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.